When I was 15, my mom kicked me out because my stepdad and his kids didn't like me, but I owned the house. It all started when my dad passed away, and it turned my whole world upside down. My dad was always the kind of guy who had everything planned out. Super organized, he'd keep receipts for things from a decade ago, just in case. It turns out he had his will arranged long before he passed. And let me tell you, it was incredibly detailed. After his death, my mom wasted no time moving on. I understood that maybe she was lonely, but it all felt too fast. One minute, we were at his funeral, and before I could even begin to process it, she was talking about some new guy she'd met. I couldn't believe it. Suddenly, I found myself dealing with the loss of my dad while this stranger, Rob, moved into our home. It happened so quickly, I barely had time to blink. One day, it was just me and my mom figuring things out, and the next day, there was this guy in our living room, acting like he'd always been there. Rob seemed all right at first, but it didn't sit well with me. My dad's belongings were still everywhere: his chair, his tools, even his favorite mug he used every morning. It felt like he was still there. But then Rob arrived, and soon, my dad's things started disappearing. My mom would say, "We need to make room for Rob's stuff," and I'd be thinking, what's the rush? It's not like Rob was paying rent. It felt like my mom was slowly erasing my dad, and it hurt. A couple of months after my dad passed, I got news about the inheritance. I remember that day so clearly because it was the first time in a while that something actually felt like it was going right. My dad's lawyer sat me down and explained everything. My dad had left everything to me, not a dime to my mom. I guess it made sense since they weren't married anymore, but it still took me by surprise. I was just a kid, and suddenly I found out I owned properties and had money. It was overwhelming. My mom, though, she was furious. She tried to act supportive, but I could see it in her eyes. She wasn't expecting that outcome. She probably assumed she'd get something, but it was all mine. And because my dad was so meticulous, she had no way to challenge it. He had locked everything down so tightly that if she tried to contest it, she'd lose. At first, she played nice, saying things like, "I'm so happy for you, sweetheart. Your dad loved you so much," but it didn't take long before she started pushing. She'd often bring up how it would be nice if I shared some of it with her, as a kind gesture or something. She always framed it like it was my choice, but the way she said it, it felt more like pressure. Then one day, she came to me with this plan. She asked if I'd consider transferring one of the properties to her. I remember just standing there, staring at her, thinking, is she serious? She said it would make things easier for Rob, help him feel more secure, like he was part of the family. She wanted to put the property in her name to show Rob he was welcome. In her mind, it was all about making Rob feel comfortable so they could build a future together. But to me, it felt like she was choosing him over me. I had just lost my dad and was still struggling to get through each day, and now she was asking me to give up a part of his legacy to please her new boyfriend. It felt like she didn't care how I felt at all. I told her I couldn't, even if I wanted to. My dad's will was set up so I couldn't access any of the inheritance until I turned 21. The look on her face when I told her that, I'll never forget it. She tried to hide it, but she was furious. I think she knew she couldn't change anything, but it didn't stop her from trying. Every now and then she'd bring it up again, testing the waters, asking if I was sure I couldn't transfer just one property. Each time, I had to remind her that there was nothing I could do. It wasn't up to me. It was how my dad had set things up. To be honest, even if I could have given her the property, I don't think I would have. It felt like it would have been a betrayal of my dad's memory. This was his way of ensuring I had a future, and I wasn't about to mess that up just to make my mom's new boyfriend feel secure. Then there were Rob's kids, his son, who was 18, and his daughter, 19. My mom was bending over backward to make them feel at home. They were all right, I guess, but my mom treated them differently from me. It wasn't that she was awful to me, but there was a noticeable difference in how she treated them. She'd plan trips for all of them, and every single time, she'd suggest I spend the weekend with my grandparents instead. She'd never outright say, "You can't come," but it was obvious she didn't want me around. As a kid, I didn't know how to react to that. I just went along with it, hoping that maybe one day she'd change her mind, but she never did. I spent a lot of weekends at my grandparents' place. And don't get me wrong, they were amazing, but every time I heard about one of those trips, it was a reminder that my mom was choosing her new life over me. Looking back, I think my dad must have seen something like this coming. Why else would he leave everything to me and not my mom? Maybe he knew where things were heading between them, Or maybe he just wanted to make sure I'd be taken care of if anything happened to him. Either way, I'm thankful he did. But it definitely complicated things with my mom. It felt like I was caught in the middle, trying to protect what my dad left me while also navigating my mom's new family. That's pretty much how it went for a while. Rob gradually settled in, and my mom made sure his kids felt completely at home. As for me, I kept my distance, trying to keep the peace, but it wasn't easy. I was only 15, trying to figure everything out, and I knew deep down that things would never be the same again. By the time I was 17, things between me and Rob had gone from awkward to downright tense. At first, I didn't really care about him, he was just my mom's new boyfriend. But soon, he started acting like he was in charge, and that's when everything went downhill. This was my dad's house, and suddenly Rob was moving his stuff in, giving me attitude, and telling me what I could and couldn't do. It wasn't subtle either. He'd say things like, "You need to show more respect," or "It's time you learn some discipline." I'd just sit there thinking, who does this guy think he is? He wasn't my dad, and he definitely didn't have the right to act like he owned the place. I pushed back every time he tried to impose his rules. I made it clear that the house wasn't his, and I even gave him a nickname, John Conroy. Honestly, it didn't mean anything, but it bugged him, and that was enough for me. Every time he tried to tell me what to do, I'd say, "All right, John Conroy, whatever you say." It got under his skin, and things between us started getting heated. It was like a silent war. He'd make snide remarks, and I'd snap back. My mom, of course, tried to play peacemaker. She'd say things like, "You two just need time to adjust to each other," or "Rob's only trying to help you grow up," but I knew it wasn't about that, it was about control. Rob wanted to be the boss, and I wasn't about to let that happen. Worse, my mom started siding with him more and more. She'd get upset with me for disrespecting him, even saying, "You need to understand that Rob's part of our family now." Our family, as if I'd agreed to any of it. I'd tell her, "This isn't his house, it's Dad's," but she never listened. She just kept pushing me to get along and try harder. Then, one day, everything blew up. Rob had been mouthing off about how I needed to pull my weight around the house, and it got to me. I told him straight to his face, "You're not my dad, and this isn't your house." His face turned red, and my mom rushed in to calm things down. She looked at me and said, "Why do you always have to fight with him? Why can't you just respect him?" And I fired back, "Why should I? He doesn't respect me, and he definitely doesn't respect that this was Dad's house." That argument was the breaking point. Rob stormed off, and my mom just stood there, looking tired and fed up. Then, she dropped the bombshell, "This isn't working. We can't keep fighting like this. I think it's best if you find somewhere else to stay for a while." I couldn't believe it. I waited for her to take it back or say she didn't mean it, but she didn't. She looked me right in the eyes and said, "It's not just your house. It's our home, and Rob and his kids deserve to feel comfortable here too." A wave of anger and hurt hit me all at once. She was choosing them over me. There was no denying it anymore. She tried to justify it, saying, "I'm doing this for your own good, so you can have some space and cool down." But I knew it wasn't about that. It was about making things easier for her and Rob, so they could have their perfect little family without me in the way. I stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind me. I was furious, and I had no idea what to do next. I was 17 with no job that paid enough to live on my own, and all my belongings were in my house. I went upstairs and started packing, just throwing stuff into bags without even knowing where I was going to go. Thankfully, my grandparents stepped in. They had always been there for me, even when my mom wasn't, and they offered me a place to stay. I grabbed onto that offer like it was a lifeline. My grandpa picked me up that evening, and I remember sitting in the car, staring out the window, feeling numb. Everything had crumbled in one day. My own mom was kicking me out of the house my dad had left me. When I moved into my grandparents' place, it felt safe. They were incredible, and they never made me feel like I was a burden. My grandpa, especially, went out of his way to make me feel better. He said, "You're always welcome here, kiddo. Don't let anyone make you think otherwise." After everything with my mom, I needed to hear that. It was a relief to know that someone had my back. But my mom? She still came by sometimes, acting like everything was fine. She'd say things like, "I love you, you know that, right? I'm just trying to keep the peace." It felt like she was trying to ease her guilt over what she had done. One time, she even brought over some of my old things, saying she thought I'd want them at my grandparents' place. I just stared at her, thinking, "You want to act like this is normal." But it's not. She'd go on about how she was doing what was best for everyone, how Rob needed space to feel at home, and how I'd understand one day. I'd nod along, but inside I felt like she was just justifying her own choices. She'd also say things like, "You'll always have a home with us when you're ready." It took everything in me not to tell her that it wasn't my home anymore, it was Rob's. It was hard to see her and not feel angry. She was supposed to be the one person on my side, and instead, she chose a guy she'd known for a couple of years over me, her own son. And she acted like kicking me out was somehow for my benefit, like it was her way of helping me grow up. After a while, I just stopped engaging with her visits. I stayed polite, but I stopped letting her excuses get to me. Instead, I focused on school, my friends, and my grandparents, who became my true family during that time. My grandma would always reassure me, saying, "You've got us, and you're going to be okay." Even though I still felt hurt and angry, their support made things a bit easier. Over time, I realized my mom was never going to be the parent I needed. She was too focused on building her new life with Rob and his kids, while I became a reminder of the old life she wanted to leave behind. So I started moving on too. If she could choose Rob over me, I decided I could focus on myself. With my grandparents behind me, I learned to stand on my own 2 feet, even if it meant not having my mom in my life. Honestly, that was probably the best lesson I learned back then, learning to rely on myself and knowing when to walk away, even from those who were supposed to care. After I finished college, I knew it was time to take a serious look at the properties my dad had left me. The entire time I'd been living with my grandparents, I kept reminding myself that these properties were my chance to build something for myself. My dad had planned everything so I'd have a future, even without him around, and I wasn't going to waste that. One of the properties my dad left me was the house where my mom and Rob were living, the same house I used to live in before everything went downhill. It was a good place, with a solid structure in a nice neighborhood, perfect for renting out if I ever got the chance. So, with my degree in hand and the possibility of going for a master's degree, I thought, why not renovate it and rent it out? Having extra income wouldn't hurt, especially if I planned on going back to school. I knew I'd have to break the news to my mom eventually, and I didn't expect it to go smoothly, but it had to be done. One day, I went to the house, ready to have the conversation. My plan was simple. I'd tell her about my intention to renovate and give them a reasonable amount of time to figure out their next steps. I knew it would be tough, but I hoped that if I approached it respectfully, she might understand. Well, that plan never got off the ground. When I knocked on the door, no one answered. The house was completely silent, and their car wasn't in the driveway. I figured they might just be out running errands, so I waited for a while. But after some time, it became clear they weren't coming back anytime soon. I tried calling my mom, left a voicemail, and even sent a text explaining I'd stopped by and wanted to talk. Still, no response. Later that night, I found out from my grandma that my mom and Rob were on vacation. She mentioned it casually like, "Oh, your mom and Rob went down to Florida for a few days." I was stunned. Here I was, trying to have a mature conversation about my property, and they were off on a beach vacation. I get that people need breaks, but a heads up would have been nice. I waited a few more days, hoping she'd get back to me, but still nothing. No calls, no texts, just silence. I started feeling like she was avoiding me, and that made things even harder. I needed to move forward with my plans, but I couldn't do that if she kept dodging me. So after waiting around for a while, I decided to take matters into my own hands. Legally, the house was mine, my name was on the deed, and I had been paying the property taxes every year. I had every right to take control of the situation. I made the decision to change the locks. I know it sounds extreme, but it felt like the only way to make it clear that I was serious. I needed to start the renovation process, and I couldn't have them treating the house like a vacation spot while I was trying to move forward. So I called a locksmith, got the locks changed, and made sure I had all the keys. While I was there, I took a moment to look around. Being back in the house where I grew up felt strange, but it didn't feel like home anymore. It felt like a stranger's place, filled with bits and pieces of my mom and Rob's life. Seeing it that way only made me more determined to stick to my plan. The next day, my phone started blowing up. My mom had finally come back, and she was furious. I had a bunch of missed calls and angry voicemails from her, demanding to know why they couldn't get inside. She said things like, "How could you do this to us? And this is so disrespectful." I could feel her anger pouring through the phone. I had expected her to be upset, but hearing it still hit harder than I thought it would. When she called again, I finally picked up. She started shouting before I could even say hello. "Why did you lock us out of the house?" she demanded. I tried to stay calm and explained that I had been trying to reach her for days to talk about my plans. But she didn't want to hear it. She kept repeating, "You can't just kick us out like this, and we have nowhere else to go right now." I explained that I had given them plenty of time and that I had every right to take back the house. I told her I planned to renovate it and had tried to give her a heads up, but she wasn't listening. "This is still my home," she said. "You can't just take it away from me." That's when I realized there was no reasoning with her. To her, it wasn't about what was fair or legal. It was about what she felt she deserved. At that point, I had to draw the line. I told her they had 2 weeks to find another place to live. I wasn't trying to be cruel. I wanted to give them a chance to move their things and figure things out, but 2 weeks was all I could offer. I told her that after that, the renovation work would start, and they couldn't stay. The silence on the other end of the line was almost worse than the yelling. When she finally spoke, her voice was cold and distant. "I never thought you'd do this to your own mother," she said. That hit me like a punch in the gut, but I knew that if I backed down now, I'd never be able to move forward. This was about me taking control of my life, and sometimes that means making difficult decisions. I didn't hear from her for the rest of the day. But the next morning, I showed up at the house to start preparing for the renovations, and guess who was waiting for me in the driveway? My mom and Rob both stood there, visibly angry. Rob tried to act tough, stepping up like he could intimidate me into letting them stay. He spat, "You think you can just kick us out like this? You have no right." But I didn't flinch. I calmly told him, "This isn't your house, and it never has been. I'm the one paying for it, and I'm the one in charge here." He was fuming, but he couldn't argue with that. Then my mom started crying, saying I was being unfair and leaving them homeless. She accused me of being just like my father, but it wasn't meant as a compliment. Her words stung, but I kept my composure. I tried to be rational and said, "Look, I've given you 2 weeks to figure things out. I'm being fair, but I need to start the renovations soon. This is my property, and I have to do what's best for me." Tears streamed down her face as she shook her head, saying she couldn't believe how heartless I was being. Rob stood there, trying to look tough, but I could tell he knew he had no real say in the matter. Watching my mom cry and seeing how upset she was, it wasn't easy. I felt guilty even though I knew I was doing the right thing. Still, I understood that if I let them stay, I'd never be able to get them out. This was my chance to reclaim what was mine, and I couldn't let it slip away. As they finally left, it felt like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, but there was also a tight knot in my chest. I knew I had made the right decision, but that didn't make it hurt any less. I drove back to my grandparents' house, knowing I'd have to stay strong and see this through, no matter how hard it got. After telling my mom and Rob they had 2 weeks to move out, I thought things would start to calm down. I figured they'd be angry at first, but eventually they'd start packing and accept the situation. I mean, they didn't really have any other choice. But of course, nothing is ever that simple. Instead of quietly handling the situation, my mom decided to turn everything into high drama. The very next day, I went back to the house to start preparing for the renovations. I wanted to check out the backyard and take measurements for the work I had planned. I had a contractor coming in a few weeks, and I needed to make sure everything was ready. I was out there with my notepad, jotting down notes, when I suddenly heard the back gate swing open. I turned around, and there was my mom, storming in like she was on a mission. She was livid, practically yelling before I even had a chance to say anything. "How could you do this to us?" she shouted, her face red and tear-streaked. She kept going, throwing her hands in the air and demanding to know how I could betray my own family. "We have nowhere else to go. What do you expect us to do?" she cried. My heart was racing, but I tried to stay calm. I told her, "Mom, I gave you 2 weeks. You have time to figure things out. I'm not throwing you out without warning." But she didn't want to hear it. She kept ranting about how selfish I was and how much she had sacrificed for me. Her words were clearly aimed at making me feel guilty for wanting my own space back. Then Rob showed up with that same tough guy attitude, thinking he could intimidate me into backing down. "You think you can just order us around because you own this place? We've built a life here," he shouted. I looked him dead in the eye and replied, "No, Rob, I built a life here. This was my dad's house, and I'm taking back what's mine." That wasn't what he wanted to hear. He got even more worked up, and for a second, I thought he might actually try something. But my mom stepped in, placing a hand on his chest, telling him to calm down. She turned back to me, tears still streaming down her face. "Please," she begged. We need more time. We have nowhere else to go." Just then, Rob's stepdaughter, the 19-year-old, came out of the house, crying and holding her stomach. I hadn't even noticed her until she stepped onto the porch. That's when my mom blurted out, "She's pregnant. You can't do this to her. You can't kick us out when she's about to have a baby." That revelation hit me hard. I hadn't expected it. For a moment, I just stood there, not knowing what to say. It felt like they were pulling out every possible card to get me to change my mind. And sure, I felt bad for her. Being young and pregnant is a lot to deal with. But I also knew I couldn't let that change anything. I took a deep breath and told them, "Look, I'm sorry she's going through this, but this is still my house. I've given you 2 weeks. I'm not asking you to leave today." My mom broke down into sobs, and Rob just stood there, looking like he was about to explode. It got to the point where I couldn't stand being there any longer. I told them, "I've made my decision. I need this place back. I'll come by in 2 weeks to check in," and then I walked away. It wasn't easy. As I left, I could still hear my mom yelling, calling me heartless and selfish, saying she couldn't believe her own son would do this to her. But I had to keep going. If I stayed any longer, I knew I'd start second-guessing myself, and I couldn't afford that. When I got back to my grandparents' house, I tried to focus on my renovation plans. I pulled out the paperwork, reviewed my notes, and did my best to keep my head clear. But it was hard. My mom's words kept echoing in my head, and the guilt started creeping in. I mean, no one wants to be the bad guy, especially not when it involves family. Then my phone started buzzing. It was a relative of my mom's, an aunt I barely ever talked to. She was saying, "I heard what happened, and I just have to say I'm disappointed in you. Your mom's in a tough spot, and you're making it worse." She kept going on about how cruel I was being and how I needed to help my mom out because that's what family does, and it wasn't just her. Over the next few days, I started getting calls and texts from other relatives, all saying the same thing. They called me selfish and told me I should give my mom more time, or even let her stay. They acted like I was the villain, like I was throwing her out for fun or something. No one seemed to understand that this was about my future too. At one point, my grandma noticed how stressed I was getting and sat me down. "Listen," she said, "you did what you had to do. Don't let them guilt trip you into thinking you're wrong. Your dad left you this house for a reason." That helped, a little. It was comforting to know she was on my side, but it didn't make the phone calls and messages any less frustrating. The worst part was when one of my mom's relatives sent me a long message about how my mom was caught in the middle and that I needed to show compassion because she was just trying to keep the peace. That one really got to me. I wanted to reply and say, "How is she caught in the middle when she's the one who chose them over me?" But I didn't. I knew arguing wouldn't help. It would just add fuel to the fire. So I started ignoring the calls and messages. I figured if they were so worried about my mom, they could help her out. They could offer her a place to stay or help her find somewhere new. But none of them were stepping up to do that. As expected, it was easier for everyone to pin the blame on me. Classic. In the days that followed, I shifted my focus to the renovation plans. I met with the contractor, discussed the details, and set a timeline. Even though I knew I'd eventually have to deal with my mom and Rob again, I kept reminding myself this was for me, my future. I had spent too long letting other people dictate what I could or couldn't do, and now was my chance to take control. And despite all the drama, I started feeling better about my decision. Deep down, I knew I was doing what my dad would have wanted. He left me those properties so I could have a future, and I wasn't about to let anyone take that from me, not even my own mother. By the end of that first week, the guilt had started to fade. I wasn't the one at fault here. I had given them time, and I was being fair. If my mom and Rob wanted to drag this out and make it more difficult, that was their problem. I just needed to stay strong and stick to my plan. As the 2-week deadline approached, I mentally prepared myself for the inevitable confrontation. Part of me hoped they'd have found a place and would leave quietly, but realistically, I knew better. Given how things had been going, I was sure they'd try to make this as hard as possible. When the day came, I pulled into the driveway, and sure enough, there they were, my mom, Rob, and even a few friends and relatives, all standing around like they were putting on some kind of show. My stomach sank, but I stayed calm. I knew if I showed any signs of stress, they'd use it against me. As I approached, my mom rushed over, tears streaming down her face, launching into an emotional plea. "I can't believe you'd do this to us. You're my son. How can you turn your back on me when I need you the most?" It was the kind of thing that would have gotten to me if I hadn't been preparing for it. I had played her words over and over in my head for days. So I kept my composure and told her, "Mom, I gave you 2 weeks. That's fair, and you know it. This is my house, and I have every right to take it back." She kept shaking her head, insisting I was being unreasonable and that 2 weeks wasn't enough time, but I knew better. If they'd really tried, they could have found something, or at least made progress. They were stalling, hoping I'd cave. Then Rob chimed in, all fired up like he was ready for a fight. "This is our home. You can't just show up and take it from us like this." Tension was rising, but I stayed steady. "Actually, I can. Legally, it's my property. I've been patient, but now it's time for you to move out." I could see the anger boiling in his eyes, but he couldn't argue with that. That's when the relatives jumped in. One of my mom's cousins stepped forward, ranting about how family should stick together and how I was acting like a landlord instead of a son. "Your mom has done so much for you, and now you're just abandoning her." It felt like everyone was ganging up on me, trying to make me feel like I was the worst person in the world. I took a deep breath and responded, "I understand you're trying to help, but this isn't your business. My dad left me this house for a reason, and I'm doing what I have to do." That didn't sit well with her. She scoffed and walked away, muttering about how heartless I was. It became clear this wasn't going to be a quick conversation. They were all waiting for me to crack, hoping I'd feel guilty enough to change my mind. But I knew if I gave in now, they'd never leave. It would just lead to more excuses, more drama, and more pressure. I had to stand firm, no matter how bad it felt. My mom started crying even harder, saying, "I don't know where we'll go. We don't have any money saved for this." I had to bite my tongue to keep from saying what I was really thinking, which was, maybe you should have thought of that before letting this drag on, but I knew that wouldn't help. Instead, I calmly said, "I'm sorry, but I need this space back. You have to find another option." She then switched gears, asking for more time. "Just 1 more month," she begged. "We'll definitely find something by then." I almost felt myself wavering for a second, but then I remembered how she'd used that tone before. It was always about getting more time, more leniency, but nothing ever changed. If I gave her another month, I'd be standing here again in the same situation. So I told her, "I've already given you as much time as I can. I can't wait any longer." Rob, of course, started ranting again about how I was kicking them out with nowhere to go, but I kept repeating myself, "This is my house." I'm taking it back over and over like a broken record. I knew they were just trying to wear me down. Then Rob's stepdaughter, the one who's pregnant, came out onto the porch, holding her stomach and looking like she was about to burst into tears. "Please," she begged, "we don't have anywhere to go. I'm about to have a baby. We need a roof over our heads." That hit hard. It's tough not to feel something when a scared, pregnant teenager is begging you for help. But I reminded myself that it wasn't my responsibility. It was a tough situation, but I had to focus on what was best for me. "I'm really sorry," I said, "but I've given as much time as I can. I hope you find somewhere soon." Then I turned and walked away. As I left, my mom screamed after me, saying she'd never forgive me for this, but I kept walking. I knew if I stopped, if I turned around and saw her face again, I'd start doubting myself. I couldn't let that happen. When I got back to my car, I was hit with a mix of emotions. Part of me felt relieved, like I'd finally taken control and made the tough decision I needed to. But another part of me felt terrible. It's one thing to tell yourself you're doing the right thing, but it's another to feel it when everyone around you is saying you're wrong. I sat in my car for a while, just trying to breathe and not let everything sink in too much. I knew they were angry, and I was sure they were talking behind my back, but I had to remind myself that I was doing what I needed to for my future. My dad left me these properties for a reason, and I wasn't going to let guilt or pressure ruin that. When I finally drove off, I felt a bit lighter. It hadn't been easy, and I knew there would be more backlash, but I had taken the first step. I stood my ground, and now it was up to them to figure out their next move. I wasn't going to let them drag me down with their problems. I had my own plans, and I was sticking to them, no matter how many people tried to guilt trip me. The rest of the day, I focused on my renovation plans. I set up more meetings with the contractor, went over the designs, and started moving things forward. It felt good, like I was finally taking the steps I needed to move on with my life. Sure, there was still that lingering weight from everything that had happened, but I knew I'd made the right choice. I wasn't going to let anyone tell me otherwise.